The bitter herbs of Corsica clung to Napoleon's boots as he stood atop Monte Rotondo, his small frame rigid against the wind that carried both the salt of the Mediterranean and the acrid smoke of revenge. Below, Ajaccio sprawled like a scattered handful of sun-bleached bones, each building a reminder of the power that had slipped through his family's fingers. But it was not the city that held his gaze. It was the horizon, where the vast Mediterranean stretched endlessly toward France, toward destiny. He was 9 years old, and he had already learned to hate. The memory of his father's murder was still fresh, a wound that refused to heal. Charles Bonaparte had not died the dignified death that the official records claimed. Stomach cancer, they said, a natural end for a respected advocate. Napoleon knew better. He had seen the glass vial, heard the whispered conversations between his mother Letizia and Uncle Joseph Fesch, watched as his father writhed in agony while the poison did its work. The Pozzo di Borgo family had finally succeeded in their vendetta, though they would never openly claim their victory. Napoleone, his older brother Joseph's voice carried up the mountainside, interrupting his dark thoughts. "Mama is looking for you." Napoleon's fingers clenched around the rough stone he'd been holding, knuckles white with tension. Joseph, always the perfect son, always the one who followed the rules. He had not been there when their father died. He had not heard the last words Charles Bonaparte had whispered to his second son, "Avenge me but with patience. Power is the only protection." "I'm coming," Napoleon called back, his Corsican accent thick with emotion. He would learn to hide that accent later, but for now it was still a badge of his identity, even if it made him a target for the French boys at school. The descent from Monte Rotondo was treacherous, but Napoleon had learned every loose stone and dangerous patch. Like everything else in his life, he had mapped it, strategized it, mastered it. His small size made him agile, able to navigate paths that larger boys couldn't manage. It was one of the few advantages of being perpetually undersized for his age. As he approached their house, once grand, now showing signs of genteel decay, he could hear his mother's voice raised in argument with Uncle Fesch. "He must go to France, Letizia. The scholarship to Brienne is an opportunity we cannot refuse." "He is too young." His mother's voice carried the weight of a woman who had buried 3 children already. "And France. France is not kind to Corsican boys." Napoleon paused in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. His mother stood like a statue carved from Mediterranean marble, her black mourning dress making her seem even more austere. At 34, Letizia Bonaparte was still beautiful, but grief and determination had etched permanent lines around her mouth. Uncle Fesch, by contrast, was all movement, pacing the worn floor of their salon with nervous energy. "It is because he is Corsican that he must go," Fesch argued. "What future is there for him here? The French have won. Paoli is in exile. We must adapt, or we will perish." Napoleon felt his chest tighten at the mention of Pasquale Paoli, the great Corsican patriot who had fought for their island's independence. Before his father's death, Napoleon had spent hours listening to stories of Paoli's resistance against the French, imagining himself leading armies to liberate Corsica. Now those dreams tasted like ashes in his mouth. "I'll go," Napoleon said, stepping into the room. Both adults turned to look at him, surprised by his quiet entrance. "I want to go to Brienne." Letizia's face softened as she looked at her son. "Napoleone, you don't understand what it will be like. The French boys, I understand exactly what it will be like, Mama." His voice was steady, older than his years. "And I will learn from them. Everything they know, everything they are, I will learn it all. And then I will become better than any of them." The room fell silent. In that moment, something shifted in Letizia's eyes as she truly looked at her second son. Perhaps she saw what others would eventually see. The burning ambition, the calculating intelligence, the unbending will that would one day reshape Europe. "Very well," she said finally, "but remember what I have taught you. Make your plans carefully. Never waste your strength on unnecessary battles." "See, Mama." Napoleon nodded, already thinking ahead to what he would need to prepare. The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Napoleon spent his days organizing his few possessions and studying the French language with fierce determination. His nights were different. In the darkness of his room he would unfold the map of France that his father had given him, tracing the routes between cities, memorizing the names of provinces and fortresses. Sometimes Joseph would find him asleep at his desk, head resting on the worn parchment. It was during one of these late-night study sessions that he heard the first whispers of revolution stirring in France. Uncle Fesch had visitors, French merchants who spoke in hushed tones about dissent in Paris, about a weakening monarchy and growing unrest. Napoleon pressed his ear to the floor, straining to catch every word. He didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough. France was changing, power was shifting. The day of departure came too quickly and not quickly enough. The family gathered at the port of Ajaccio, where a small ship waited to carry Napoleon and Joseph to the mainland. Their younger siblings clustered around them, Lucien, Elisa, Louis, Pauline, and Caroline, with baby Jerome crying in their mother's arms. "Remember who you are," Letizia told them, her voice stern, even as her eyes glistened. "Remember you are Bonaparte." Napoleon nodded, but his mind was already on the horizon. He had spent his last night on Monte Rotondo, making a promise to himself and to the memory of his father. He would master the language of their conquerors, learn their ways of war, understand their weaknesses. He would rise through their ranks, gather power like others gathered wealth, and when the time was right. The journey to France was rough, the Mediterranean showing its temperamental nature. While Joseph spent most of the voyage sick below deck, Napoleon stood at the rail, watching the waves with the same intensity he brought to studying maps. Each surge of water, each shift of wind, became a lesson in nature's strategy, in the power of forces beyond human control. Their first sight of Toulon harbor struck Napoleon with its military precision, the fortifications, the arranged ships, the disciplined movement of soldiers and sailors. It was everything Corsica was not, and for a moment, homesickness threatened to overwhelm him. Then he remembered his father's last words: "Power is the only protection." The carriage ride to Brienne-le-Château took 3 days, during which Napoleon barely spoke, absorbing every detail of the French countryside. Joseph attempted conversation, but eventually gave up, leaving his younger brother to his thoughts and his carefully concealed anxiety. Brienne Military School rose before them like a challenge, its stern walls and rigid lines a stark contrast to the flowing architecture of Ajaccio. As they passed through the gates, Napoleon heard the whispers begin immediately. "More charity cases from the provinces. Look at the small one. Is he even old enough to be here? Corsican savages." Napoleon's face remained impassive, but his fingers tightened on the strap of his worn bag. He had expected this. What he hadn't expected was the calculating look from an older boy who stood apart from the others, watching the new arrivals with intelligent eyes. "I am Augustin Robespierre," the boy said, approaching them as Joseph was led away to the older students' quarters. "You must be the Bonapartes." "I am Napoleon," he replied, carefully pronouncing his name in the French way, though it felt foreign on his tongue. "Napoleon," Augustine repeated, testing the name. "You'll want to be careful here. The sons of old nobility don't take kindly to provincial scholarship students." It was a warning, but also an offer of alliance. Napoleon recognized it for what it was, his first lesson in French politics. "I am not here to be liked," Napoleon said quietly, his accent still thick but his words precise. "I am here to learn." Augustine's eyebrows rose slightly. "Learn what?" Napoleon looked up at the older boy, and for a moment his carefully maintained mask slipped, revealing something that made Augustine take a small step back. Everything. The first months at Brienne were a crucible that would have broken a lesser spirit. The other boys, sons of French nobility, made sport of tormenting the small Corsican with his strange accent and second-hand uniforms. They mocked his size, his poverty, his island heritage. But each insult, each practical joke, each physical confrontation was a lesson that Napoleon absorbed and catalogued. He learned to fight not with fists, though he became proficient enough when necessary, but with wit and strategy. When Antoine de Saint-Cyr, the largest of his tormentors, orchestrated an ambush in the dormitory, Napoleon was ready. He had spent weeks observing patterns, gathering allies among the servants and younger students, setting his pieces in place. The ambush turned into a trap, with Antoine and his friends caught by the prefect in a compromising position that resulted in their temporary suspension. Napoleon never openly claimed responsibility, but his slight smile as the boys were led away said enough. "You're playing a dangerous game," Augustin warned him afterward. "They'll only hate you more now." "Let them hate," Napoleon replied, bent over his mathematics homework. "As long as they fear." But not all his relationships at Brienne were built on conflict. He found unexpected friendship in Jean-Baptiste Murat, a quiet boy with a gift for artillery calculations that matched Napoleon's own. Together, they would spend hours discussing military strategy, poring over accounts of great battles, debating the merits of different tactical approaches. "You see here," Napoleon would say, pointing to a diagram of Alexander the Great's battle formations, "how he used the terrain to funnel the enemy exactly where he wanted them. That's not just military science, it's art." The professors began to take notice of the strange Corsican boy, who seemed to absorb military knowledge like a sponge. Even those who despised his background couldn't deny his brilliant mind, particularly in mathematics and strategy. It was during his second year that the nightmares about his father's death began to fade, replaced by dreams of glory. In these dreams, he saw himself leading armies, redrawing the maps of Europe, building an empire that would dwarf Alexander's. He would wake from these visions with his heart racing, not from fear, but from anticipation. The turning point came during the winter of his third year. Antoine de Saint-Cyr, still smarting from his earlier humiliation, gathered a group of older boys for one final attempt to break the Corsican spirit. They caught Napoleon alone in the school's courtyard during a heavy snowfall. What they didn't know was that Napoleon had been expecting this moment. He had spent months studying the art of fortification, and during the preceding days of snowfall, he had secretly organized the younger students into teams, building snow fortifications that appeared random but were actually carefully planned. When Antoine and his friends attacked, Napoleon gave a sharp whistle. Suddenly the courtyard erupted into chaos as dozens of younger students emerged from hiding places, armed with carefully prepared snowballs. The ensuing battle became legend at Brienne, the day the small Corsican outmaneuvered and defeated boys twice his size, using nothing but snow, strategy, and the loyalty he had quietly built among the lower classmen. It was more than just a snowball fight. It was Napoleon's first real victory, his first taste of commanding others in battle, even if that battle was fought with snow instead of bullets. The school's military instructors, watching from their windows, saw something that day that made them begin to pay very close attention to Charles Bonaparte's second son. As Napoleon stood in the aftermath, watching Antoine and his friends retreat in disarray, he felt something shift inside him. The anger and pain that had driven him since his father's death didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else, a cold, calculating ambition that would never be satisfied with mere revenge. That night, he wrote a letter to his mother. "Mama, you told me to choose my battles carefully. I understand now what you meant. Power isn't just about strength, it's about seeing the whole field, understanding your enemies, and knowing when to strike. I promise you this. Every lesson I learn here, every skill I master, every alliance I build will serve our family's honor. They think they can break me because I am Corsican, because I am small, because our nobility is not as ancient as theirs. They don't understand that this only makes me stronger. One day they will all learn what it means to underestimate a Bonaparte. Your son, Napoleon." As he sealed the letter, the wind howled outside his dormitory window, carrying the promise of more snow, more battles, more opportunities to prove himself. Napoleon smiled slightly, remembering the taste of herbs on Monte Rotondo, the salt of the Mediterranean, the bitter resolve of revenge. He was no longer just the boy who had watched his father die. He was becoming something else, something that would make the whole world remember his name. In the years to come, those who survived to tell the tale would remember this time at Brienne, would try to pinpoint the moment when a grieving Corsican boy began his transformation into the man who would become emperor. Some would point to the snow battle, others to his brilliant academic achievements or his fierce defense of his heritage. But Napoleon himself, if asked, might have said it began on that mountainside in Corsica, with the taste of bitter herbs and the weight of his father's last words. Power is the only protection. He had learned that lesson well, perhaps too well, and this was only the beginning. Time moved differently within the walls of the École Militaire in Paris than it had at Brienne. Napoleon felt it in the weight of each hour, in the tension of each lesson, in the growing awareness that beyond these walls France itself was changing. 5 years had passed since that first bitter day at Brienne, years that had transformed him from a grieving Corsican boy into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. The autumn of 1784 painted the gardens of the École Militaire in shades of blood and gold, a prophecy Napoleon would not understand until years later. At 15, he stood at the window of his Spartan quarters, watching the older cadets drill in the courtyard below. His fingers traced patterns on the glass, not random movements, but battle formations, the mathematics of death he had learned to love. "Still studying, Bonaparte?" The voice belonged to Alexandre de Mazy, one of the few French nobles who had deigned to befriend the Corsican scholarship student. "You'll wear out your eyes before you ever see a real battle." Napoleon didn't turn from the window. "The real battles are already being fought, Alexandre. Not here, not with swords and muskets. Not yet, but soon." He could feel Alexandre's confusion without seeing it. How could he explain what he sensed in the letters from home, in the whispered conversations between instructors, in the growing tension that seemed to pulse through Paris like a fever? France was a powder keg, and Napoleon had spent his years at Brienne and the École Militaire learning exactly where to place the fuse. "You're in one of your moods again," Alexandre sighed, dropping into the room's single chair. "Speaking in riddles like some Corsican oracle. What happened in mathematics today? I heard Laplace actually smiled at one of your solutions." Now Napoleon did turn, a rare half-smile touching his lips. He didn't smile. He frowned less severely than usual. There's a difference. The memory was still fresh, standing at the blackboard, chalk dust on his fingers as he solved the complex artillery trajectory problem that had stumped the other students. Professor Laplace's eyes had widened slightly as Napoleon added the final calculation, accounting for wind resistance in a way the great mathematician himself hadn't considered. "You've approached this uniquely, Monsieur Bonaparte," Laplace had said, his voice carefully neutral. "Where did you learn to consider environmental factors in this way?" "From watching the wind on Monte Rotondo, sir," Napoleon had answered truthfully. "The way it affects the flight of birds, the movement of leaves. Nature teaches us mathematics if we know how to observe." It was the longest conversation he'd had with any instructor in months. Napoleon preferred to watch, to listen, to absorb. He had learned that silence was often the best strategy. Let others reveal their weaknesses through endless talk, while he built his strengths in secret. The years at the École Militaire had taught him more than just military science. He had learned to read people as easily as he read maps, to identify the fault lines in their characters where pressure could be applied. His classical education had given him the language of power, Latin phrases that could make simple thoughts sound profound, historical references that could turn personal ambition into universal destiny. But it was artillery that had captured his soul. In the elegant mathematics of trajectories, in the brutal poetry of exploding shells, he had found his true calling. Artillery was the perfect blend of science and destruction, of precision and power. It was also, he had noted carefully, the branch of service most likely to advance a man of low birth but high talent. "You should come to the salon tonight," Alexandre was saying, pulling Napoleon from his thoughts. "The Marquis de Caulaincourt is hosting. His daughter will be there. You know, the one who's been asking about you." Napoleon shook his head. "I have studies to complete." "Studies? Bonaparte, you're already the top student in artillery. What more can you possibly learn from those books?" Everything, Napoleon thought, but didn't say. Every battle ever fought, every strategy ever conceived, every mistake that had toppled empires and every triumph that had built them. The library had become his second home, its volumes his most trusted advisors. While other cadets spent their evenings in salons and taverns, Napoleon devoured military histories, political treatises, philosophical works that helped him understand the machinery of power. But it wasn't just book learning that occupied his nights. In secret, He had begun writing his own treatise on artillery tactics, incorporating innovations that would have shocked his instructors. The manuscript was hidden beneath his mattress, along with letters from Corsica that spoke of growing unrest, of opportunities for a man bold enough to seize them. "You'll never make connections hiding in your room," Alexandra persisted. "In France, it's not just what you know, it's who you know," Napoleon finished. "Yes, you've mentioned this before. But times are changing, my friend. Soon it won't matter who your father was or which salon you attended. What will matter is what you can do, what you can offer France in her hour of need." Alexandra stood, shaking his head. "You sound like those radicals in the coffee houses. Be careful, Bonaparte. Such talk is treason?" Napoleon's smile was razor-sharp now. "No, it's prophecy. Go to your salon, Alexandra. Enjoy the wine and the witty conversation. I have other battles to prepare for." After Alexandra left, Napoleon returned to his studies, but not before retrieving a letter that had arrived that morning from Corsica. His mother's handwriting was as stern as ever. "Napoleone, your brother Joseph writes that you speak of revolution, of change coming to France. Remember that change brings opportunity, but also danger. The wise serpent waits in its hole until it knows which way the storm will blow. Your father's enemies still walk the streets of Ajaccio. They speak of you, of your success at the military school. Some with pride, some with fear. Good, let them fear. But do not strike too soon. Your mother, Letizia." Napoleon folded the letter carefully and added it to his growing collection. His mother didn't understand, or perhaps understood too well. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here. He could feel it in the restless energy of Paris, in the angry mutters of the common people, in the nervous laughter of the nobility. The next morning brought news that would accelerate his plans. The artillery examination results had been posted, and Napoleon's name topped the list. At 16, he would become the youngest artillery officer in the French army, assigned to the La Fère artillery regiment. As he packed his few possessions, Napoleon paused at the window one last time. Below, the morning drill continued, students moving in precise formations that seemed suddenly childish, theoretical. Real battle awaited, and with it, real power. His first posting would take him to Valence, a quiet garrison town that most young officers would have considered a disappointment. But Napoleon saw opportunity. Valence was close to the Italian border, and Italy would be important, though he couldn't yet say why. He felt it in his bones in the same way he had felt the coming revolution. The La Fère regiment welcomed its newest officer with the typical mix of skepticism and curiosity. Napoleon's youth and small stature drew the usual whispers, but his reputation as a mathematical genius had preceded him. The veteran sergeants, who had seen dozens of young officers come and go, watched him carefully during those first weeks. What they saw surprised them. Unlike other young nobles who treated their first posting as a social occasion, Napoleon threw himself into every aspect of artillery operation. He learned the names of every gun crew member, studied the maintenance of each piece, and spent hours practicing loading and firing procedures until he could do them faster than the veterans. "He's different, this one," Sergeant Marcel Dubois commented to his fellow NCOs one evening. "Watch how he studies the guns, not like a boy with a new toy, like a hunter studying his weapon." The comparison was apt. Napoleon approached artillery with the same cold calculation he brought to everything else. Each cannon became a variable in his ongoing mathematical equation of power. He learned their ranges, their reload times, their optimal positioning for different terrains. But more importantly, he learned the men who served them. It was during this time that Napoleon began to develop the leadership style that would later make him legendary. He discovered that soldiers, like the schoolboys at Brienne, responded to a combination of strict discipline and personal attention. He memorized details about their families, their backgrounds, their hopes. This information was carefully catalogued alongside battle formations and firing solutions, ammunition requirements, and supply calculations. When winter came to Valence, bringing with it the kind of bone-chilling cold that made artillery practice miserable, Napoleon was always present, standing in the snow with his men as they ran their drills. He suffered every hardship alongside them, earning their respect in a way his noble birth never could. But it wasn't all military discipline. In the evenings, Napoleon could often be found in his quarters, surrounded by books and maps, working on his treatise on artillery tactics. The work had grown from a simple technical manual into something more ambitious, a complete reimagining of how artillery could be used in modern warfare. "The gun is not just a weapon," he wrote in one passage, "it is a key to unlock victory. Properly positioned artillery can multiply the effectiveness of infantry tenfold, but more than that, it can break the enemy's will before a single infantryman draws his sword." The psychological impact of sustained bombardment cannot be overestimated. These weren't just theoretical musings. Napoleon was developing a new approach to warfare, one that would combine the traditional elements of strategy with a deep understanding of human psychology. He understood that battles were won not just by superior firepower or better tactics, but by breaking the enemy's spirit. As 1789 approached, bringing with it the first tremors of revolution, Napoleon was ready. He had transformed himself from the angry boy of Brienne into a composed, calculating officer. His accent had been polished away, his manners refined, his knowledge of French military history and tactics honed to a razor's edge. But beneath this polished exterior, the fire of ambition burned hotter than ever. The revolution, when it came, would create opportunities for men of talent, regardless of their birth. Napoleon intended to be ready when those opportunities arose. In his private journal, he wrote, "The old order is dying, choking on its own excesses. What will replace it? Not the mob. They can destroy, but they cannot build. Not the moderates. They lack the courage to seize power and the strength to hold it. No, France will need something new. Leaders who understand both the mathematics of power and the psychology of glory. The time is coming when a man of destiny can reshape the world. I have studied war in books. Soon, I will study it in blood." He could not have known how prophetic these words would prove to be. The revolution was about to tear France apart, creating a vacuum that would need to be filled. As the old certainties crumbled, as ancient loyalties were tested and broken, as the very foundations of European society began to shake, Napoleon Bonaparte waited and watched, like a mathematician observing the collapse of an equation he had already solved. The time of preparation was ending. The time of action was about to begin. And in that action, the world would discover that the quiet, studious artillery officer from Valence had been preparing for something far greater than anyone could have imagined. The revolution would provide the opportunity, but it would be Napoleon's genius, cold, calculating, and utterly ruthless, that would seize it. The boy who had once stood alone on Monte Rotondo, dreaming of revenge, was gone. In his place stood a man who had learned to dream of empire. Thunder lived in Napoleon's bones, not the ephemeral crash of storm clouds, but the deep, constant rumble of artillery that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. Standing at the edge of the battlefield near Lodi, he felt it pulse through the earth, each impact marking another step in his inexorable march toward destiny. The Italian sun hung low and bloody on the horizon, its light catching the waters of the Po River in ways that transformed it into a river of fire, or perhaps blood. It had been 6 years since the revolution had torn France apart, 6 years since he had first tasted real battle. In that time, Napoleon Bonaparte had transformed himself from a mere artillery officer into something else entirely, a force of nature that reshaped the very landscape of war. The Battle of Lodi awaited, but his mind drifted back to his first true test of command, when theory had finally met reality in a baptism of fire. Toulon, 1793. The smell of gunpowder mixed with the salt air of the Mediterranean, creating an acrid perfume that made Napoleon's nostrils flare. He stood before the assembled staff officers, all of them older, all of them skeptical of the young artillery commander who dared to tell them their strategy was wrong. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar quality of quiet authority that made men lean forward instinctively, "you've been attacking the city from the wrong direction. Toulon isn't the target. Fort Leguillette is the key. Take that position, and the British fleet must withdraw or face destruction. Without the fleet, the city falls." General Carteau, a former painter who had somehow risen to command through revolutionary fervor rather than military skill, scoffed. And I suppose you, Captain Bonaparte, know better than your superiors how to conduct this siege? Napoleon's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. I know artillery, sir, and I know that from Fort Leguillette, our guns can dominate the entire harbour. The mathematics is irrefutable. He unrolled a detailed map, weighted at the corners with spent cannonballs. His fingers traced the firing lines he had calculated, each angle precise, each trajectory measured to the yard. This wasn't just theory. He had spent weeks studying the terrain, understanding how the wind off the Mediterranean would affect shell trajectories, how the slope of the land would impact recoil. The British call it Little Gibraltar, one of the staff officers muttered. It's impregnable. Nothing is impregnable, Napoleon replied, his voice soft but filled with absolute conviction. Every fortress has a weak point. Every defense can be broken. It's simply a matter of applying force precisely where it will do the most damage. He had learned this lesson years ago, watching his father die from a carefully administered poison. Power wasn't about brute force. It was about knowing exactly where to strike. The assault on Fort Leguillette proved him right. Napoleon personally directed the placement of each battery, working through driving rain and enemy fire to position his guns exactly as his calculations demanded. The men called him the Little Corporal then, not out of derision but with growing respect, as they watched him help manhandle cannon into position, his uniform as mud-stained as theirs. When the batteries opened fire, it was like the world had ended. The sophisticated mathematical calculations translated into pure destruction as tons of iron and explosives arced through the air with deadly precision. Napoleon stood in the midst of it all, calmly giving orders as shells screamed overhead. "Time your shots," he shouted above the thunder of the guns. "Let them feel the rhythm of their doom, every 4 seconds like a heartbeat." A young artillery lieutenant named Jean-Baptiste Murat watched in awe as Napoleon moved from battery to battery, adjusting elevations by fractions of degrees, transforming the chaotic bombardment into a devastating symphony of destruction. "Sir," he said during a brief lull, "I've never seen artillery used like this before." Napoleon's smile was fierce. "That's because no one has ever understood its true potential. Artillery isn't just about destroying walls, it's about destroying will. Listen." They stood in silence for a moment, feeling the steady pulse of the guns. "Do you hear it?" Napoleon asked. "The rhythm never changes. It's relentless, mathematical, inevitable. That's what breaks men's spirits. Not the destruction itself, but the certainty that it will never end." The British fleet was forced to withdraw exactly as Napoleon had predicted, and with it went any hope of holding Toulon. His reputation began to grow, whispered about in military circles. The young artillery officer who could bend mathematics to his will, who could break any fortress if given enough guns. But it was during the liberation of Toulon that Napoleon learned another crucial lesson. As he walked through the captured city, he saw how quickly glory could turn to ashes, how thin the line was between victory and atrocity. The revolutionaries' reprisals against suspected royalists were brutal, and Napoleon watched it all with cold calculation. That night, he wrote in his journal, "Victory must be more than destruction. The mob can destroy. Animals can kill. True power lies in creation, in building something from the ruins, in making men believe in glory rather than mere revenge. I begin to understand that to rule, one must be both feared and loved, must offer both the sword and the laurel wreath." The years that followed Toulon were a blur of battles and increasingly complex political maneuvering. Napoleon rose through the ranks, not just through military success, but through a careful cultivation of his image. He learned to speak to common soldiers in ways that made them feel part of something greater than themselves. His proclamations became legendary, transforming minor skirmishes into epic conflicts for the soul of France. But it was in Italy that he truly began to understand the full scope of his destiny. The Italian campaign of 1796 would prove to be more than just a military operation. It would be the forge in which the legend of Napoleon Bonaparte would be hammered into its final shape, which brought him back to Lodi, to the blood-red sun setting over the Po River, to the moment when he would transform from a brilliant general into something approaching mythology. "General," Captain André Masséna approached, his usually pristine uniform caked with mud and worse. "The bridge is secured. The Austrians are in full retreat." Napoleon nodded, but his mind was already racing ahead, calculating trajectories, visualizing the next move in this grand game of conquest. The smell of gunpowder still hung thick in the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood and the sweeter, more terrible scent of death. These were the perfumes of power, and he had grown to savor them. "Send riders to pursue them," he ordered, his Corsican accent now barely detectable after years of careful practice. "I want to know exactly where Beaulieu withdraws to. Every farmhouse, every crossroad, every possible position of resistance." The battle itself had been a masterpiece of timing and courage. The Austrian guns had commanded the bridge, their position seemingly impregnable. But Napoleon had seen the weakness in their deployment, had understood how to exploit it through a combination of artillery support and raw courage. The charge across the bridge had been something out of legend. Napoleon had positioned his artillery with surgical precision, using their fire to force the Austrian gunners to duck behind their fortifications at crucial moments. Then, the infantry had surged forward like a human tide. The first wave had been cut down mercilessly, their bodies falling into the churning river below. But the second wave had made it further, and the third wave further still. Napoleon had watched it all, his mind calculating casualties against progress with the same cold precision he once used to solve mathematics problems at Brienne. Then he had seen something that changed everything. A young lieutenant, barely older than Napoleon had been when he left Corsica, had picked up a fallen standard and rallied the men around him. For a brief moment, that lieutenant had become something more than human. He had become a symbol, an idea, a focal point for the desperate courage of hundreds. "Follow me," the lieutenant had shouted, his voice somehow carrying over the thunder of guns and the screams of the dying. "For France, for glory." Napoleon had watched as the men surged forward with renewed vigor, following not orders but inspiration. The Austrian defenses had crumbled before this wave of human determination, and within minutes, the bridge had been taken. The lieutenant hadn't survived. Napoleon had found his body later, the standard still clutched in death-stiffened fingers. He had knelt beside the fallen officer, studying his face with an intensity that had made nearby soldiers uncomfortable. "Your name, Lieutenant?" he had asked one of the survivors. "Pierre Muiron, sir, Jean-Baptiste's younger brother." Napoleon had remembered then Jean-Baptiste Muiron, his friend from Brienne, the quiet boy who had shared his passion for artillery calculations. Another debt to be repaid, another name to be remembered. Now, as the sun finally surrendered to the horizon, Napoleon reached into his coat and withdrew a worn letter, its edges softened by frequent handling. His mother's handwriting remained as stark and uncompromising as ever. "My son, you write of glory, of destiny, of remaking the world. Remember that pride comes before the fall. Your father died because he reached too high, too fast. Do not make his mistakes. L.B." Napoleon's jaw tightened. His mother was wrong. His father had died because he hadn't reached high enough, hadn't gathered enough power to protect himself. That was a mistake Napoleon would never make. The Battle of Lodi had taught him something crucial. As he'd watched his soldiers charge across that bullet-swept bridge, as he'd seen men fall and others take their place without hesitation, he'd understood a fundamental truth. Men would die for glory far more readily than they would die for gold. He pulled out his personal journal, the one that never left his side, and began to write. "Men are moved not by orders, but by dreams. They will die for glory more readily than they will live for comfort. I have seen it today, the transformation of common soldiers into heroes through nothing more than the power of belief. This is the key to everything. The Austrians fight because they must. My men fight because they choose to, because they believe in something greater than themselves. This is how empires are built, not through force alone, but through the careful cultivation of faith. Faith in glory, faith in destiny, faith in their general. I am becoming something more than a commander. I am becoming a symbol, a focal point for their dreams of glory. This is power beyond anything my father could have imagined. This is how you change the world." He closed the journal and looked out over the battlefield once more. The dead would be buried, the wounded tended to, the victory recorded in the dry language of military reports. But something else had been born here today, something that couldn't be captured in official dispatches. Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy who had once stood alone on Monte Rotondo dreaming of revenge, was dead. In his place stood something new, a man who had discovered that true power lay not in the ability to take lives, but in the ability to inspire men to give their lives willingly. The realization should have humbled him. Instead, it fed the growing flames of his ambition. If men would die for glory, what wouldn't they do for a living God? As darkness claimed the battlefield completely, Napoleon began to plan his next move. The victory at Lodi was just the beginning. He would drive the Austrians from Italy, yes, but that was merely the first step. Each battle would add to his legend. Each victory would increase his power until... He smiled slightly, remembering the bitter herbs of Corsica, the taste of poverty and humiliation. How far he had come from those days. How much further he would go. In Paris, the Directory might still see him as just another general, useful, but ultimately replaceable. They didn't understand what was happening here in Italy. They couldn't see that every battle, every speech, every carefully orchestrated moment of glory was building something unprecedented in human history. Napoleon turned away from the river of blood and walked back to his headquarters, where maps of Italy and beyond awaited his attention. His staff officers looked up as he entered, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar quality that made men lean forward instinctively, "today we have won a battle. Tomorrow we begin winning a war. And after that..." He paused, letting the moment stretch. "After that, we reshape the world." The officers exchanged glances. They had heard bold words from generals before, but something about the way Napoleon spoke made these words different. These weren't the empty boasts of a glory-hungry commander. They were statements of fact, as certain as mathematical proofs. As the night deepened and the planning continued, the sounds of the army at rest drifted through the windows. Men singing victory songs, sharing wine and stories, already transforming the day's slaughter into legend. Napoleon listened to it all, understanding that each tale told, each song sung, each story of bravery embellished in the telling, was another brick in the foundation of his growing power. The candles burned low as Napoleon bent over his maps, plotting the next moves in his grand strategy. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the ambitions of men. But Napoleon didn't look up at them anymore. His eyes were fixed firmly on the future, a future he would forge with blood and glory, with courage and calculation, with an ambition that would reshape the very foundations of Europe. The boy who had dreamed of power was gone. In his place stood a man who had tasted it, who understood its true nature, and who would never stop hunting it until he had devoured every last morsel the world had to offer. And somewhere in the darkness, the ghost of a young lieutenant who had died for glory watched as his sacrifice was transformed into another step on one man's climb to godhood. Power had a scent. Napoleon Bonaparte discovered this on a sweltering evening in Paris as he climbed the marble stairs of the Luxembourg Palace. It smelled of expensive perfume masking desperate fear, of polished wood and old blood, of ambition cloaked in revolutionary virtue. He had returned from Italy not just a victorious general, but a changed man, one who had learned to savor such subtle fragrances. The salon of Josephine de Beauharnais buzzed with the nervous energy of prey animals, sensing a predator in their midst. Ladies in elaborate gowns whispered behind painted fans, watching as the small Corsican officer moved through their midst with the fluid grace of a hunting cat. He was not handsome in the traditional sense, but there was something in his presence that made the air feel charged, dangerous. Josephine watched him from across the room, her dark eyes calculating beneath heavy lids. She had survived the terror by wit and charm, had navigated the treacherous waters of post-revolutionary society with the skill of a master sailor. But this man was different from the other ambitious generals who had sought her favor. "They say he makes kings tremble," whispered Rose, one of Josephine's confidants, "that he can break armies with mathematics and bend men's wills with words." Josephine's smile was as practiced as a fencer's stance. "Then perhaps he needs a woman who can bend him." Their eyes met across the crowded salon, and in that moment, two predators recognized each other. Napoleon saw in Josephine a weapon as deadly as any cannon, a key to the society that had once scorned him. Josephine saw in Napoleon an opportunity, a force of nature she might harness to ensure her survival in a world that devoured the weak. Their courtship was a dance of daggers. Napoleon's letters burned with an intensity that frightened and fascinated her. "My soul is consumed by your image. My heart beats only for your love. But know this, I will reshape the world to lay at your feet, or I will burn it to ashes trying." Josephine kept these letters, not out of sentiment, but because she recognized their future value. She had learned during the Terror that everything, even love, could be currency. Their marriage was a calculated alliance that somehow spawned real passion, at least on Napoleon's part. But even as he plotted his next military campaign, Josephine was already betraying him with Lieutenant Hippolyte Charles, a handsome young officer who offered the kind of uncomplicated pleasure she craved. Napoleon learned of the affair while in Egypt, where the heat and alien landscape had already begun to transform his ambitions into something grander and more terrible. The letter detailing Josephine's infidelity arrived along with reports of Nelson destroying the French fleet at Aboukir Bay, effectively stranding the army in Egypt. That night, alone in his tent, Napoleon experienced something that would change him forever. The combination of military setback and personal betrayal cracked something in his psyche, allowing a darker power to seep through. "So be it," he whispered to the desert night. "If I cannot be loved, I shall be feared. If I cannot have loyalty, I shall have obedience." The next day he ordered the execution of 3,000 Turkish prisoners at Jaffa. His generals were shocked by the cold efficiency with which he commanded the massacred. But Napoleon had learned a lesson. Mercy was a luxury that gods could not afford. When he abandoned his army in Egypt to return to France, he did so without hesitation or regret. Loyalty, he had decided, was a chain that bound both ways. Better to be free, to rise above human constraints of honor and obligation. The reunion with Josephine was a masterpiece of political theater. She had rushed to meet him, fearing his revenge, only to find him cold but controlled. Her tears and protestations of love met an invisible wall of ice. "My dear," he said, his voice soft but carrying an edge that made her shiver, "you have taught me something invaluable. Love is a weakness that those destined for greatness cannot afford. But you need not fear, I have use for you yet." It was in this period that Napoleon began to understand how to weaponize mercy. He would forgive Josephine publicly, magnanimously, making her dependent on his goodwill while demonstrating his godlike capacity for benevolence. It was a pattern he would repeat with others who betrayed him, when it suited his purposes. The transformation of Napoleon Bonaparte from ambitious general to something approaching divinity accelerated in the months that followed. He began to eliminate rivals with surgical precision, each move calculated to increase his power while maintaining the illusion of republican virtue. General Jean-Baptiste Kleber, who had been left in command of the army in Egypt, prepared a damning report about Napoleon's desertion. Before he could deliver it, he was assassinated by a religious fanatic. Few believed the official story, but fewer dared to question it. Napoleon's former friend, General Jean-Charles Pichegru, was found strangled in his prison cell after hinting he might reveal damaging information about the rising star's past. The death was ruled a suicide, despite the obvious signs of struggle. Each death, each convenient accident, each sudden disgrace that befell his opponents added to the aura of invincibility that Napoleon carefully cultivated. He wanted to be feared, but not as a tyrant, as a force of nature, an instrument of destiny. The coup of 18 Brumaire was almost an afterthought, the formal assumption of power by one who had already mastered its essence. When he walked into the Council of 500 and faced the deputies' outrage, it was not with the uncertainty of a general overstepping his bounds, but with the calm assurance of a god tolerating mortal impertinence. "You would threaten me?" he asked softly as they crowded around him, shouting accusations of tyranny. "I have walked through storms of grapeshot. I have commanded armies in 3 continents. I have seen the face of death and made it bow to my will. What are your words to me?" When the troops cleared the chamber of protesting deputies, Napoleon felt nothing, no guilt, no remorse, no uncertainty. He had transcended such human weakness. That evening, as he sat in the Luxembourg Palace, now his palace, he penned a letter to his mother. "You once warned me about pride, about reaching too high too fast. But you did not understand, Mamma. It is not pride that drives me now, but destiny. I have looked into the abyss of power and seen my reflection there. France needs more than a leader. It needs a symbol, a force of nature, a God made flesh. I have learned that true power comes not from the love of the people, but from their need to believe in something greater than themselves. I have become that something. Your devoted son, Napoleon." Letizia Bonaparte read the letter in her home in Corsica, and for the first time felt a chill of genuine fear for her son. She recognized in his words not the voice of the boy who had once dreamed of avenging his father, but something colder, something that had moved beyond human concerns of family and love. As First Consul, Napoleon began the methodical process of consolidating his power. Each decree, each reform, each carefully orchestrated public appearance added another layer to his growing legend. But it was in the quiet moments, in the private acts of calculation and control, that his true transformation became apparent. He kept files on everyone who might be useful or dangerous, their habits, their weaknesses, their secret shames. Knowledge, he had learned, was a form of power more subtle, but no less effective than artillery. Those who had known him in his youth began to disappear from his inner circle, replaced by men who would see him only as he wished to be seen. The few who remembered the angry boy from Corsica were given comfortable but distant positions, or met with unfortunate accidents. The betrayals cut both ways. Napoleon's own Minister of Police, Joseph Fouché, maintained a network of spies, watching his master even as he served him. Napoleon knew this, of course. He had learned to see betrayal in men's eyes before they even conceived it themselves. Instead of eliminating Fouché, he fed him carefully crafted misinformation, turning the spymaster's own network into an unwitting tool. When Fouché finally moved against him, thinking he had sufficient evidence of Napoleon's vulnerabilities, the trap snapped shut with elegant precision. "My dear Fouché," Napoleon said, reviewing the secret documents his minister had gathered, "did you really think I would leave such obvious traces, that I would be so careless with power?" Fouché's normally impassive face showed a flicker of fear. "I was only doing my duty, ensuring the security of the state." "Of course you were," Napoleon smiled, "and you will continue to do so. But now you'll do it knowing that I can destroy you at any moment, with evidence far more convincing than these clumsy forgeries. Serve me well, and we need never speak of this again." It was a masterclass in the art of turning enemies into tools. Fouché became one of his most loyal servants, not out of love or respect, but out of the purest motivation Napoleon knew, fear mixed with self-interest. Even his siblings were not exempt from his manipulation. When his brother Lucien opposed his growing power, Napoleon did not argue or threaten. He simply smiled and said, "Family is important, dear brother. It would be a shame if anything happened to yours." Lucien left France the next day, understanding that the brother he had known was gone, replaced by something that merely wore Napoleon's face. One by one, those who stood in Napoleon's path began to fall, each elimination more elegant than the last, each death a masterpiece of political calculation. General Jean Moreau had been a friend once, a brilliant military commander who had won victories for France alongside Napoleon. But Moreau had made the fatal mistake of maintaining his republican principles, of suggesting that perhaps France needed no emperor. The evidence of his conspiracy was manufactured with exquisite attention to detail. "How you understand, of course," Napoleon said softly, watching as his former friend stood before him in the Tuileries, "that I cannot ignore such serious accusations of treason." Moreau stood proud, his military decorations glinting in the lamplight. "These accusations are false, and you know it, Bonaparte. We fought together, bled together, and that is why I'm offering you a choice," Napoleon interrupted, his voice gentle as a lover's whisper. "Public execution as a traitor, your name forever marked with shame, or exile. Your family's reputation and fortune intact, your children's future secure. Choose wisely, old friend." The way Moreau's shoulders slumped told Napoleon he had calculated correctly. Another potential rival eliminated, not with violence, but with the surgical precision of a political surgeon. But not all eliminations could be so elegant. Georges Cadoudal, the stubborn Chouan leader who had orchestrated multiple assassination attempts, required a more direct approach. When he was finally captured, Napoleon visited him in his cell, curious to meet a man who had come so close to killing him. "You could have had wealth, position, power," Napoleon mused, studying the defiant royalist through the cell bars. "Why persist in this doomed cause?" Cadoudal's laugh was harsh. "Because some of us cannot be bought, Corsican. Some of us remember what honor means." "Honor?" Napoleon smiled. "Tell me, how many of your fellow conspirators talked under torture? How many noble names did they give up? Honor breaks, Monsieur Cadoudal. Everything breaks. The execution was public, a message to others who might dream of resistance. But it was the interrogations beforehand that truly demonstrated Napoleon's evolution. He had personally overseen the questioning of suspects, calculating exactly how much pressure to apply, exactly which threats would break which men. The most dangerous rivals, however, were those closest to him. General Augereau, who had once been Napoleon's mentor, made the mistake of speaking too freely about the young general's past, about incidents in Italy that were better left forgotten. Napoleon invited him to dinner, just the two of them, in a private chamber of the Tuileries. "Two old times." Napoleon raised his glass, watching as Augereau drank deeply. "You know, I've always valued your institutional memory." Augereau set down his glass, his face suddenly pale. "The wine. You wouldn't." "Nothing so crude," Napoleon assured him. "But in about 6 hours you will feel the first symptoms. It will appear to be a natural illness. You'll linger for weeks, giving you time to consider the value of discretion. Whether you live or die depends entirely on how many of your memories you choose to share during that time." Augereau lived, though he never spoke of the past again. He became another object lesson in Napoleon's growing collection, a reminder that even old loyalties meant nothing to a man ascending to godhood. The assassination attempts began soon after he assumed power. Napoleon survived them all, each failed attempt adding to his mystique. Some said he could not be killed by mortal means. Others whispered that he had made a pact with darker powers. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. Napoleon had learned to think like an assassin, to see every angle, to trust no one completely. He slept little, ate only what was prepared under his direct supervision, and kept his plans fluid enough that even his closest advisors never knew his full intentions. But it was lonely being a god. In the deep watches of the night, when even Paris slept, Napoleon would sometimes stand at his window in the Tuileries, looking out over the city that had become both his kingdom and his prison. On one such night, as he contemplated his next move, the transformation of republic into empire, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the darkened glass. For a moment, he saw not the face of power, but the ghost of that young boy from Corsica, watching him with sad, knowing eyes. Was it worth it, the reflection seemed to ask, the betrayals, the deaths, the sacrifice of every human connection? Napoleon smiled, and in that smile was the answer that would doom millions. "Ask me again when I rule the world." The boy in the reflection faded, leaving only the face of the man who would become emperor. Outside, Paris slept uneasily beneath the stars, not yet knowing that it had given birth to something beyond human, something that would reshape the continent with blood and glory. The transformation was almost complete. But Napoleon knew that one final step remained. To truly become a god, he would need more than power. He would need consecration, and for that, he would need the Pope himself to kneel before him. As he turned from the window, his mind was already spinning plans within plans, each one bringing him closer to his ultimate destiny. The night was deep, but Napoleon Bonaparte did not sleep. Gods, after all, had no need for rest. Divinity, Napoleon discovered, had a price. It was measured not in gold or blood, though both flowed freely in his rise to power, but in the steady extinction of whatever humanity remained in his soul. He felt it happening, watched it with the same cold fascination with which he had once observed enemy formations through his spyglass. The methodical transformation of a man into something else entirely. The Tuileries Palace was silent, save for the whisper of Napoleon's boots on marble as he paced the empty halls. Dawn was still hours away, but sleep had become a stranger to him. Gods, he had decided, had no need for such mortal weaknesses. Besides, the dead kept him company in these quiet hours, the growing collection of rivals, friends and former allies whose elimination had paved his path to absolute power. Their ghosts gathered in the shadows of the palace, but Napoleon no longer feared them. They were simply the price of necessity, stepping stones on his ascension to divinity. Each death had been a lesson in power, each betrayal a step toward perfection. The latest addition to his spectral court had been the Duke of Enghien, whose execution had sent shockwaves through Europe. The young Bourbon prince had been seized from neutral territory, given a mockery of a trial, and shot in the moat of Vincennes Castle. It was more than just an execution. It was a message written in royal blood. The old order was dead, and Napoleon Bonaparte was its executioner. He remembered the night of the Duke's death with perfect clarity. "It will cause an international incident," Talleyrand had warned, his face carefully neutral as they discussed the Duke's fate. "The violation of Baden's neutrality alone—" "Good," Napoleon interrupted, his voice soft but carrying an edge that made even the experienced diplomat fall silent. "Let them be shocked. Let them whisper about the monster Bonaparte, who dares to spill royal blood. Fear will serve us better than respect." The execution was carried out in the pre-dawn darkness. Napoleon had ordered lanterns placed in the moat, their light catching the moisture on the castle walls like tears. The Duke had faced death with the courage of his bloodline, refusing a blindfold. "I die for my king, for my faith, for—" The volley of shots cut off his last words. Napoleon, watching from a window above, felt nothing but a cold satisfaction. Another remnant of the old world swept away, another step toward his destiny. Later that night, he found Josephine in her chambers, her face pale with horror at what she had heard. "He was of royal blood," she whispered, "a prince of the House of Bourbon." "There is only one royalty now," Napoleon replied, studying his reflection in her mirror. "Only one blood that matters. The age of inherited power is over. The age of seized power begins." The memory faded as Napoleon reached his private study. Maps covered the walls, not just of France or Europe, but of the known world. Each territory was marked with notes in his precise handwriting, calculations of resources, population, military strength. They were more than maps. They were the blueprints of empire. His gaze fell on a document on his desk, the latest draft of what would become the Code Napoleon. It was more than just a legal code. It was his vision of a perfectly ordered society where every aspect of life would be regulated, controlled, shaped to his will. Even God's laws would be subordinate to Napoleon's. A knock at the door interrupted his contemplation. "Enter." Charles Maurice de Talleyrand Périgord glided into the room like a ghost made flesh. The former bishop, now Napoleon's chief diplomat, had elevated betrayal to an art form. Napoleon kept him close precisely because he knew Talleyrand would betray him eventually. It made him predictable, useful. "The Pope has agreed to attend the coronation," Talleyrand announced, his voice carrying its usual hint of subtle irony, though he expresses concerns about certain aspects of the ceremony. Napoleon's smile was razor-thin. "Of course he does. The representative of God on earth must be troubled by the rise of a new divinity. Tell me, Talleyrand, you who were once a man of the church, can there be two gods?" "Perhaps that depends on the god, sire," Talleyrand replied carefully, "though history suggests they rarely share power amicably. History," Napoleon said softly, "is about to be rewritten." The coronation plans consumed the following months. Every detail was choreographed with military precision. The symbolic weight of every gesture, every word, every placement, was calculated to transform a military coup into divine right. The crown itself was a masterpiece of symbolism, gold leaves from Caesar's laurel wreath, combined with Charlemagne's iron crown. Past and present, republic and empire, merged into something new, something uniquely Napoleon. But it was the guest list that truly demonstrated the depth of his transformation. Those who had once been his equals, Fellow generals, revolutionary leaders, old friends, would now stand and watch him ascend. Their presence was required not to share in his glory, but to witness their own diminishment. Even his family would play their parts in this grand theatre. His sisters were given ancient royal titles, his brothers made into kings of conquered territories. Their resentment was palpable, but their dependence on his power was absolute. "You're making us into a dynasty," his brother Joseph accused during a private audience. "But we're not royal blood, we're Corsican nobodies." "Blood?" Napoleon laughed, the sound empty of warmth. "Blood is nothing. Power is everything. I am creating something greater than mere royalty. I am becoming living proof that a man can rise to godhood through will alone." The night before the coronation, Napoleon stood alone in Notre Dame Cathedral, studying the space where history would be made. The ancient stones seemed to whisper with the weight of centuries, of kings crowned and kingdoms fallen. But none of them, he knew, had dared what he planned. In his mind's eye he could already see it, the moment when he would take the crown from the Pope's hands and place it on his own head. It would be more than mere theatrics. It would be a declaration that power now flowed not from God down, but from Napoleon up. He would be the source, the fountainhead, the new divinity. The coronation day dawned cold and clear. Paris had been transformed into a scene from mythology, with streets lined in imperial purple and gold. The crowds that gathered were not the revolutionary mobs of a decade ago, but carefully selected spectators meant to represent the new order Napoleon had created. Inside Notre Dame, the air was heavy with incense and destiny. The Pope, that earthly representative of the old God, waited with carefully concealed apprehension. He had come to Paris believing he would crown a new king. Only now, perhaps, did he realize he had come to witness the birth of a rival deity. Josephine entered first, her beauty enhanced by the imperial robes and the weight of the moment. Napoleon watched her progress with complicated emotions. She had been unfaithful, had almost been discarded, but had proven useful enough to keep. Besides, gods needed goddesses, even imperfect ones. Then it was time. Napoleon walked down the central aisle of Notre Dame, each step measured, each gesture calculated. The crowd watched in silence, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented in human history, the moment when a man would seize not just a crown, but divinity itself. The ceremony proceeded according to ancient rites, until the crucial moment. The Pope raised the crown, prepared to place it on Napoleon's head, as had been done with kings for centuries. Then, in a motion that would be immortalized in paintings and burned into the memory of everyone present, Napoleon took the crown himself. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the perfect silence as he turned to face the assembled nobility, clergy, and dignitaries. The crown sat on his head not as a gift from God, but as a manifestation of his own will. Then, in a gesture that combined magnanimity with absolute power, he crowned Josephine himself, making it clear that all authority, temporal and spiritual, now flowed from Napoleon Bonaparte. The Pope's face remained carefully neutral, but Napoleon caught the flash of understanding in the old man's eyes. This was more than a coronation. It was a coup against heaven itself. Later, at the celebration that followed, Napoleon stood apart from the swirling crowds of courtiers and sycophants. He felt the weight of the crown, the weight of destiny, the weight of the transformation that was now complete. A servant approached with a letter. His mother had not attended the ceremony, but had sent her thoughts from Corsica. "My son, you have your crown now, your empire, your place in history. But remember this: gods may be immortal, but they are also alone. They cannot love or be loved, trust or be trusted. They can only rule. Was it worth the price? Your mother, Letizia." Napoleon crushed the letter in his fist. Worth the price? As if there had ever been a choice. As if, from that first moment on Monte Rotondo, staring at the horizon and dreaming of power, there had been any other possible outcome. He turned to the window, seeing not his reflection but the vast empire that awaited his rule. France was just the beginning. Europe would follow, and after that, the boy who had dreamed of revenge was dead. The general who had dreamed of glory was gone. Even the man who had dreamed of power had been burned away in the transformation. What remained was something new in human history, a self-made God, born not of divine right, but of pure will, ready to reshape the world in his image. As the celebrations continued below, Emperor Napoleon of France began to plan his next conquest. The crown was not enough. Europe would kneel, and then the world would learn what it meant to be ruled by a God who had once been a man. The price had been worth it. The transformation was complete. The age of Napoleon had begun. And somewhere in the shadows of Notre Dame, the ghosts of all those who had fallen on his rise to power watched and waited, knowing that even gods could fall, and that their fall was all the greater for the height they had achieved. Frost glittered like broken dreams on the Pratzen heights. Napoleon Bonaparte stood alone in the pre-dawn darkness of December 2nd, 1805, watching his breath mist in the bitter air. Below him, hidden by the infamous fog of Austerlitz, 3 armies waited to clash in what he had already determined would be his masterpiece. Not just a battle, but a symphony of destruction, a canvas upon which he would paint with blood and glory. He had spent the night, as he spent all nights now, alone with his thoughts and the growing weight of divinity. Sleep was a mortal weakness he had largely abandoned. Instead, he had walked among his troops, a ghost in a grey overcoat, listening to their conversations, feeling the electric anticipation that preceded his perfect battle. "The Emperor walked past my fire last night," he heard one young grenadier tell his companions. "I swear his eyes glowed in the dark, like he could see right through the fog." Napoleon smiled slightly at the whispered words. Let them build their myths. Gods needed worship as surely as armies needed victory. He had learned to cultivate both with equal precision. The sound of hoofbeats approached. Marshal Lannes, one of his few remaining friends from the old days, though even that friendship had grown complicated with the weight of empire. "Sire," Lannes said, pulling his horse to a stop, "the enemy is moving exactly as you predicted. They're concentrating their forces to the south, weakening their center." "Of course they are," Napoleon replied softly. "They dance to music only I can hear, Marshal. By sunset today, 2 emperors and a king will watch their armies shatter against the anvil we have prepared." Lannes shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. There was something different about the emperor lately, something that went beyond the normal confidence of a successful commander. His certainty had taken on an almost religious quality, as if defeat was not merely unlikely, but metaphysically impossible. The Marshal remembered a different Napoleon, the young general who had shared wine and dreams in Italy, who had seemed merely extraordinary rather than divine. That man had been ambitious but human. This being who stood before him now, outlined against the lightening sky, seemed to have transcended such mortal limitations. "The men are ready," Lannes reported, pushing aside his unease. "They're calling it your birthday battle." Napoleon nodded. December 2nd, 1 year exactly since he had crowned himself Emperor of France. The symmetry pleased him. History, he had discovered, appreciated such artistic touches. The fog was beginning to lift as the sun rose, revealing the vast chessboard he had prepared. The allied armies of Austria and Russia stretched across the countryside below, nearly 90,000 strong, commanded by 2 emperors and their most experienced generals. Against them, Napoleon had positioned his Grande Armée with the precision of a mathematician composing a proof. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. He had deliberately weakened his right flank, presenting an irresistible target to the enemy. They would commit their forces there, thinking to roll up his army from the south, never realizing they were marching into a carefully prepared kill-box. Once they were fully committed, his real strike would take the Pratzen heights, splitting their army in 2. It would be, he had already decided, perfect. The battle began exactly as he had foreseen. Through his spyglass, Napoleon watched the Allied columns march south, their uniforms pristine, their formations exact. All that precision, all that martial pride marching steadily into his web. Like watching fate itself unfold, he murmured to his assembled staff. They believe they are acting freely, making choices, exercising their vaunted strategic wisdom. They don't understand that every step was ordained the moment I chose this field. Marshal Soult, positioned to command the crucial strike at the Allied center, shifted nervously. "The fog is lifting faster than expected, sire. They will see exactly what I wish them to see," Napoleon interrupted. No more, no less. The sun that reveals their doom is the same sun that crowned me emperor. Today it will crown me master of Europe. As if in answer to his words, the sun burst through the last remnants of fog, creating what history would remember as the sun of Austerlitz. The battlefield lay revealed in all its terrible clarity, the Allied armies committed to their southern thrust, the Pratzen Heights waiting like a sacrificial altar. Napoleon raised his arm, holding it there as he savored the moment. Around him, his staff held their breath. This was more than a signal for attack. It was the gesture of a god about to reshape reality. Now, he said softly, dropping his arm. The response was immediate and devastating. Marshal Soult's corps, 20,000 strong, erupted from their hidden positions and struck the weakened Allied center like a thunderbolt. The sound of their advance rolled across the battlefield, drums beating the pas de charge, thousands of voices raised in battle cries, the deeper rumble of artillery being brought to bear. Through his spyglass, Napoleon watched the faces of the Allied commanders as they realized too late what was happening. He saw the moment of comprehension, of horror, of desperate attempts to reverse their commitment to the South. All useless. The trap had sprung with the precision of a mathematical equation. "Send in the guard," he ordered calmly, already seeing the next movements of his symphony of destruction. "Marshal Lannes, prepare your corps for the counterstroke." The Imperial Guard, his ultimate instrument of war, began their advance toward the Pratzen Heights. Their bearskin caps seemed to float above the morning mist like the crests of some great wave about to break upon the enemy's shore. Napoleon watched them go with something approaching tenderness. They were his finest creation, an army that had transcended mere military excellence to become an expression of his will made manifest. The battle devolved into a series of desperate engagements as the Allies tried to recover from their fatal error. Napoleon directed it all from his command post, sending reserves exactly where they were needed, timing each commitment with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. "Sire!" An aide galloped up, his uniform spattered with mud and blood. "The Russian Imperial Guard is counter-attacking on the Pratzen Heights." Napoleon smiled. Even this was expected, calculated, desired. The Russian elite would spend themselves in one final, futile gesture of defiance. Their destruction would make his victory not merely complete, but mythological. "Let them come," he said softly. "Every step they take forward is another step toward their annihilation. Sometimes the most perfect trap is the one your enemy rushes to enter." The clash at the summit of Pratzen Heights would be remembered as one of the most savage encounters of the Napoleonic Wars. The Russian Imperial Guard, the elite of the Tsar's army, met their French counterparts in a battle that seemed to shake the earth itself. Napoleon watched it unfold with the detachment of a god observing mortal struggles. As the sun reached its zenith, the extent of his victory became apparent. The Allied army was not merely defeated, it was shattered, broken into fragments that would never fully reunite. Two emperors and a king watched from a distant hilltop as their armies dissolved into chaos. But it was in the aftermath that the true cost of divinity revealed itself. Napoleon rode across the battlefield at sunset, his staff struggling to keep pace as he surveyed his masterpiece. The ground was carpeted with dead and dying men from half a dozen nations. The small stream of Goldbach had turned red with blood, and the groans of the wounded rose like prayers to an uncaring heaven. A young Austrian officer, mortally wounded, reached up as Napoleon passed. "Why?" he gasped in French. "Why such slaughter?" Napoleon reined his horse to a stop, studying the dying man with curious detachment. The officer couldn't have been more than 20, his white uniform now stained crimson. For a moment, something flickered in the Emperor's eyes, perhaps a memory of his own youth, of the boy who had once dreamed of glory on a mountainside in Corsica. "Because perfection demands sacrifice," he replied softly. "Because gods must prove their divinity through miracles. And what is a miracle but an act that defies the natural order?" The officer died without responding, his eyes still fixed on Napoleon's face. Another soul added to the growing congregation of his dead, another witness to his ascension. Later that night, in his headquarters at the Austerlitz castle, Napoleon composed his victory bulletin to Paris. His words would be studied by generations of historians, but none would fully grasp the deeper truth hidden within them. Soldiers, I am pleased with you. In the Battle of Austerlitz, you have justified all my expectations of your intrepidity. When all that is necessary to assure the happiness and prosperity of our country has been achieved, I will lead you back to France. There you will be the object of my most tender concern. My people will receive you with joy, and it will be enough for you to say, I was at the Battle of Austerlitz, for them to respond, here is a brave man. What he didn't write, what he couldn't write, was how each victory carried him further from his humanity. The perfect battle had demanded a perfect general, and perfection allowed no room for mortal weaknesses like mercy or doubt. As the celebrations continued in the camp below, Napoleon stood at his window, watching the fires dot the landscape like fallen stars. He had achieved something unprecedented today, a victory so complete that it bordered on the divine. But divinity, he was learning, came with a price that even he had not fully anticipated. The boy who had dreamed of power on Monte Rotondo would have been horrified by the cost. The general who had inspired troops in Italy would have questioned the necessity of such slaughter. But the god who stood in the castle of Austerlitz felt only the cold satisfaction of mathematics proved correct, of destiny fulfilled. A messenger arrived with reports from Paris, celebrations in the streets, declarations of his genius, poems comparing him to Alexander and Caesar. Napoleon read them with growing detachment. Such mortal acclaim seemed increasingly irrelevant to one who had transcended humanity. He turned back to the window, his reflection ghostly in the dark glass. The eyes that stared back at him were no longer those of a man, but of something else, something that had been forged in the fires of ambition and hammered into shape by the weight of empire. The perfect battle had given birth to a perfect god of war. But even as he savored his apotheosis, a small voice deep within him whispered a warning. The higher a god rises, the further he has to fall. Napoleon silenced the voice with practiced ease. Gods, after all, need not listen to the doubts of mortals, even when those doubts came from the last remaining fragments of their own humanity. Tomorrow would bring new battles, new victories, new steps toward universal empire. But for tonight, he stood alone in his castle, surrounded by the ghosts of his victory, feeling the weight of divinity settle more firmly upon his shoulders. The sun of Austerlitz had set, but the god of war was rising, and all Europe would soon learn to worship at the altar of his ambition. Winter had teeth. Napoleon Bonaparte learned this truth too late, watching from the heights above the Berezina River as his Grande Armée, once 600,000 strong, now a skeletal shadow of barely 27,000, struggled through the frozen hell of the Russian wilderness. The snow was no longer white, but stained with blood, excrement, and the black powder of burnt dreams. Had it only been 6 months since they had crossed the Niemen River in all their glory? The memory seemed to belong to another lifetime. The endless columns of men and horses stretching to the horizon, eagles gleaming in the summer sun, drums beating out the rhythm of inevitable victory. They had been an army of gods then, led by a living deity who had never known defeat. Now they were meat. "Sire," Marshal Ney approached, his once resplendent uniform now a tattered shroud. His face was black with frostbite, his legendary courage revealed in the fact that he still lived while so many others had fallen. "The Russians are closing in. We must decide." "Must!" Napoleon's voice was soft, dangerous. Even now, starving and frozen like his men, he maintained that aura of divine detachment. "Gods do not bow to must, Marshal. This is merely a test of faith." Ney's eyes widened slightly. In them, Napoleon could see the reflection of what he had become. Not the tactical genius who had conquered Europe, but something else, something that had lost touch with the very reality he had once mastered so completely. The wind carried the sounds of his dying army, the screams of men who had lost limbs to frostbite, the weak cries of the starving, the constant crunch of frozen bodies being trampled underfoot by those still strong enough to walk. The smell was beyond description, a mixture of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and the sweet, sick odor of human flesh being eaten by the desperate. Napoleon had watched it all with an increasingly detached fascination. Even as his army died around him, he spoke of victory, of destiny, of divine will. His orders had become increasingly bizarre, demanding impossible marches from men who could barely stand, planning counterattacks with divisions that no longer existed. A week earlier, he had ordered a full dress parade in the snow, insisting that his soldiers maintain the same standards of appearance that had marked them in Paris. Those too weak to stand properly had been shot as examples. The survivors had watched their emperor inspect the ranks, his face serene as men literally froze to death at attention. "Remember," he had told his shivering marshals, "we are the army of the sun. This Russian winter is merely an illusion, a test of our divine purpose. Those who die simply lack the faith to transcend their mortal weakness." The reality was far different. Napoleon's army wasn't dying. It was being consumed, devoured by the very ambition that had driven them this far. The retreat from Moscow had become an odyssey of horror that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. At the Berezina crossing, Napoleon stood watching as his men fought for places on the hastily constructed bridges. The ice was treacherous, stained red with the blood of those who had fallen or been pushed to their deaths. The screams of the drowning mixed with the thunder of Russian artillery, creating a symphony of despair. "Look how they struggle," Napoleon mused to his increasingly worried staff. "Like ants trying to comprehend the movements of giants. They don't understand that their suffering is necessary, that we are writing a new gospel in blood and ice." His words were interrupted by a particularly loud explosion as a Russian shell found its mark. One of the bridges collapsed, sending hundreds of men plunging into the freezing water. Their screams were brief. The cold killed faster than the drowning. "Beautiful," Napoleon whispered, his breath frosting in the air. "Do you see how the ice forms over their faces, like nature itself is preserving them for posterity? Future generations will excavate this river and find an army of frozen gods." Marshal Ney exchanged worried glances with the other officers. Their emperor's detachment had taken on a frightening new dimension. He spoke of military maneuvers with armies that had ceased to exist weeks ago, issued orders to generals who had already frozen to death in the endless white wasteland. The horror of the retreat had taken many forms. Men who fell behind were either shot or left to freeze. Those too weak to march had begged their comrades to kill them rather than face the slow death of cold and starvation. The lucky ones got their wish. The others... Napoleon had watched a group of his soldiers butcher and eat their fallen comrades 3 days ago. Instead of horror, he had shown only academic interest, commenting on how death revealed the true nature of men, both the eaten and the eaters. "Observe," he had told his horrified staff, "how hierarchy maintains itself even in extremis. They're eating the privates first, saving the officers for last. The social order persists even in cannibalism. Fascinating." The nights were the worst. The temperature dropped so low that mercury froze in thermometers. Men who slept rarely woke, their bodies frozen solid in whatever position they had collapsed. Those who managed to find fires often burned themselves severely, their frozen flesh unable to feel the heat until it was too late. Napoleon himself seemed immune to the cold, walking through the night camp like a ghost, watching his army die with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. He spoke constantly now of divine will, of necessary sacrifices, of transcendent purpose. "You see," he explained to a dying general whose name he had forgotten, "this is not defeat. This is transformation. We entered Russia as men. We leave it as legends. Those who survive will be more than human. Those who die become martyrs in our new religion of glory." The general died without responding, his eyes glazed with a horror that had nothing to do with the cold. He had seen something in Napoleon's face that was worse than death, the complete absence of humanity, the void that lay behind the eyes of a god who had lost touch with the mortal world. As they approached the relative safety of Polish territory, the remains of the Grande Armée had to fight through Cossack formations that had been harrying their flanks for weeks. The Russians had learned to wait for the weakest moment, striking when men dropped from exhaustion or stopped to help fallen comrades. Napoleon watched these skirmishes with growing irritation. How dare these mortals interfere with his divine progression? Didn't they understand that he was leading his chosen people through a spiritual transformation? "They are like flies," he told Ney during one particularly brutal engagement. "Annoying, but ultimately insignificant. Our suffering elevates us. Their victories are meaningless in the face of our transcendent purpose. The marshal, who had been fighting rearguard actions with suicidal courage to protect the retreat, simply stared at his emperor. The man he had followed across Europe, the military genius he had trusted with his life and honor, was gone. In his place was something both more and less than human, a being that had abandoned reality for a universe of its own making. The final horror came at the Vilna gathering point. Napoleon, receiving word that a conspiracy might be forming in Paris, decided to abandon what remained of his army and race back to the capital. He announced this to his marshals, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You don't understand," he said to their shocked faces. "This entire campaign has been a spiritual journey. Those who survive have proven themselves worthy of our new order. Those who die, their sacrifice feeds our divine purpose. I go now to prepare Paris for the next phase of our transcendence." He left in a heated sledge, wrapped in furs, while his men froze in rags. As he passed through the ranks of his dying army, men who had worshipped him as a god now watched with empty eyes, finally understanding that their faith had led them only to this frozen hell. Marshal Ney, who would earn the name the bravest of the brave for his actions during the retreat, watched his emperor leave with a mixture of horror and revelation. The god they had followed into Russia had feet of clay after all, clay that had frozen and shattered in the Russian winter. The remains of the Grande Armée continued their desperate march westward. Of the 600,000 men who had entered Russia, fewer than 20,000 would ultimately survive to tell the tale. But numbers couldn't capture the true horror of what had happened. They had witnessed something perhaps even more terrifying than the physical destruction of the greatest army ever assembled. They had seen a god go mad. Napoleon's delusion had grown with each disaster, his detachment becoming more profound as the evidence of his mortal limitations mounted. The boy from Corsica, who had dreamed of power, the general who had mastered warfare, the emperor who had crowned himself god, all of these had frozen to death in the Russian winter. What emerged was something else entirely, a being divorced from reality, a divinity that had lost its grip on the very world it claimed to rule. As his sledge raced toward Paris, Napoleon composed his 29th bulletin, trying to explain the destruction of his army in terms that would maintain his divine image. The army has suffered losses, but these were due to the early onset of winter's rigors. The words rang hollow even to him, but it didn't matter. Gods didn't need to explain themselves to mortals. Let them try to comprehend the divine purpose behind their suffering. He was already planning his next campaign, his mind racing with visions of new armies, new victories, new proofs of his transcendent destiny. But in the frozen wasteland behind him, the truth lay written in blood and bone. Gods could bleed after all. And once they started bleeding, they never really stopped. The Russian campaign had revealed a terrible truth. Divinity, once achieved, could be lost. Napoleon had reached for godhood and grasped it, only to have it freeze and shatter in the Russian winter. What remained was perhaps the most dangerous being of all, a fallen god who refused to acknowledge his fall. Europe would soon learn the terrible price of such delusion. But for now the snow continued to fall, covering the remnants of Napoleon's divine ambition in a blank white shroud, while the wind howled a requiem for an army that had marched into hell following a god who had lost his way. Blood painted Leipzig's cobblestones in patterns like broken prophecies. Napoleon Bonaparte stood at his command post, watching as the greatest battle in European history devoured his dreams of empire. The autumn air carried the screams of dying men and the thunder of 1,000 guns, but it was the silence between the explosions that truly terrified him, the spaces where destiny had once whispered and now spoke no more. "Sire!" Marshal Marmont burst into the command post, his uniform stained with blood that might or might not have been his own. "Bernadotte has taken the field against us." The words struck like physical blows. Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, once his marshal, once his friend, now Crown Prince of Sweden, had joined the coalition. Another betrayal, another knife in the back, but this one cut deeper than most. "Show me," Napoleon demanded, striding to the map table. But as he studied the positions, something was wrong. The tactical genius that had once flowed through him like divine fire now stuttered and sparked. The battlefield had become a maze of betrayal, each position suspect, each ally a potential enemy. The explosion that shook the command post sent maps and markers flying. Through the smoke, Napoleon saw Swedish cavalry charging their position, their blue uniforms a mockery of French imperial colors. Behind them rode Bernadotte himself, resplendent in his new Swedish regalia. "Your Majesty," young Colonel Favier appeared, saber drawn. "We must move, the position is compromised." But Napoleon stood transfixed, watching his former marshal lead the charge against him. How many meals had they shared? How many victories had they celebrated? How many secrets did Bernadotte know? Secrets that were now being sold to the coalition for a crown and revenge? The Swedish cavalry crashed into the French guard units, protecting the command post. The fighting was savage, personal, men who had once served together now trying to kill each other, with the special hatred reserved for former brothers. Napoleon found himself drawing his own sword as the battle reached them. For a moment, he was no longer emperor, no longer a fading god, but simply a soldier fighting for survival. His blade caught the sunlight as he parried a Swedish officer's thrust, the steel ringing with a clarity that cut through the chaos of battle. "The emperor fights!" someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by the guard. It should have been a rally, a moment of inspiration. Instead, it felt like an epitaph, the day a god was forced to defend himself like a common soldier. They fought their way clear of the trap, but the damage was done. More than just men had been lost in that skirmish. Another piece of Napoleon's divine aura had been stripped away, but Bernadotte's betrayal was only the beginning. As the battle for Leipzig entered its second day, the Saxon army, 12,000 men Napoleon had counted among his most loyal German allies, suddenly turned their guns on their French comrades. Napoleon watched through his spyglass as Saxon artillery batteries positioned to protect his left flank instead opened fire on French infantry columns. The carnage was immediate and horrific. Men who had been advancing confidently suddenly found themselves caught in a crossfire, their former allies knowing exactly where to strike for maximum effect. "They knew our signals," Marshal Ney said quietly, his face ashen. "They're using our own battle plans against us." The betrayal spread like a disease through the army. Other German units, seeing the Saxons turn, began to waver. Napoleon could see it in their faces, the moment when loyalty crumbled, when self-preservation overcame oath and honor. He had once commanded armies through the sheer force of his presence, his will radiating outward like heat from the sun. Now he felt that power slipping away, each betrayal another crack in the foundation of his divinity. The third day brought the worst betrayal of all. Marshal Joachim Murat, the brave and brilliant cavalry commander, Napoleon's own brother-in-law, was conspicuously absent from his position. Reports filtered in of his negotiations with Austria, of promises made and loyalties sold. "Murat too," Napoleon whispered, the words tasting like ash. "The man I made a king." But there was no time to dwell on personal pain. The coalition armies were closing in, their attacks coordinated with a precision that spoke of intimate knowledge of French tactics. Every secret shared in confidence, every weakness revealed in trust, was now being turned against them. The fighting in Leipzig itself became a nightmare of urban combat. Every street was a potential ambush, every ally a possible traitor. Napoleon found himself surveying the battlefield not just for enemy movements, but for signs of further betrayal. The single stone bridge over the Elster River became both salvation and trap. As French units fought their way toward it, Napoleon received word that more of his German allies were changing sides. The Württemberg cavalry, the Bavarian infantry, units he had trained and equipped himself, now turned their weapons against his retreating army. "Your Majesty," the engineer officer in charge of the bridge demolition approached, his face streaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. "The charges are set, but with the chaos—" "Wait for my signal," Napoleon ordered, watching his army crumble. Too soon, and we sacrifice our rearguard. Too late. He didn't need to finish the thought. They all knew what pursued them. The bridge became a scene from hell itself. French soldiers, pressed from behind by advancing coalition forces and betraying allies, fought each other for space on the narrow crossing. Napoleon watched men who had faced Russian winter and Spanish guerrillas now descend into animal panic. Then came the sound that would haunt survivors' nightmares, the premature explosion of the bridge charges. The structure erupted in a cloud of stone and screaming men, cutting off thousands of French troops still fighting in the city. Among those trapped was Prince Poniatowski, recently promoted to Marshal of France, one of the few allies who had remained loyal to the end. Napoleon watched through his spyglass as the prince, rather than surrender, spurred his horse into the river in a desperate attempt to escape. The waters of the Elster closed over both horse and rider. Poniatowski's death seemed to symbolize everything about Napoleon's fall, loyalty drowning in the cold waters of reality, while betrayal triumphed on every side. But the greatest betrayal was yet to come. As the remnants of the Grande Armée struggled westward, Napoleon learned that Joachim Murat had not only abandoned him, but had joined the coalition. The King of Naples, the man who had married Napoleon's sister, who had led the cavalry in 100 victories, was now actively fighting against his former emperor. "Tell me," Napoleon said to Marshal Ney as they rode through the gathering darkness, "what turns a man from brother to enemy? What price buys the soul of a king?" Ney had no answer, but his silence spoke volumes. They both knew that Murat's betrayal was just the beginning. As news of Leipzig spread, as the empire crumbled, others would follow. Power attracted loyalty, like a magnet attracted iron filings, and like iron filings, that loyalty would fall away as the magnet's strength failed. The retreat became a procession of further betrayals. At Hanau, they found their escape route blocked by Bavarian forces, their former allies now trying to curry favor with the coalition by destroying their former master. The battle that followed was savage precisely because it was so personal. French soldiers, already exhausted and demoralized, found new strength in their rage at betrayal. They smashed through the Bavarian lines with a fury born of desperation and hatred. Napoleon watched the battle with a detachment that frightened his staff. He had moved beyond anger to something colder, more dangerous, a crystalline understanding of human nature that left no room for trust or loyalty. "You see," he said to his gathered marshals after the victory, "how betrayal teaches us the truth about power. Every man who turns his coat, every ally who sells his honor, proves that we were right to trust in force alone." But even as he spoke, he could see the doubt in their eyes. How many of them were already calculating their own betrayals, their own escape routes from his falling star. The army that limped back across the Rhine was a shadow of the force that had conquered Europe, but more than numbers had been lost. The mystique of invincibility, the aura of divine purpose that had sustained them through 100 victories, had been shattered by the weight of accumulated betrayals. Napoleon himself had changed. The physical transformation was subtle, a few more lines around his eyes, a slight stoop to shoulders that had once carried the weight of empire effortlessly. But the real change was in his gaze, which now held not just the cold calculation of power, but the bitter knowledge of trust betrayed. As they crossed the Rhine, Napoleon stood for a long moment staring back at the German lands that had once been the heart of his empire. The winter sun caught the waters of the great river, making them gleam like the blade of a guillotine waiting to fall. That night, alone in his tent, he wrote in his personal journal, "Betrayal, I have learned, is not merely an act but an art. Each traitor adds his own flourish to the blade before he drives it home." Bernadotte chose the elegant twist of leading armies against his former brothers. Murat selected the elaborate thrust of public denouncement. The Saxons and Bavarians preferred the crude hack of battlefield treachery. But perhaps the greatest betrayal was my own, not against others but against myself. In reaching for divinity, I forgot the simple truth that had carried me from Corsica to empire. Trust no one completely. Believe in nothing absolutely. Rely on nothing but your own will and wit. The boy from Corsica knew this. The general remembered it. The emperor forgot it. And now the fallen god must relearn it, written not in glory but in blood and betrayal. He sealed the journal and turned to the map spread across his campaign table. France lay before him like a blank canvas, waiting for one last masterpiece. But as he studied the familiar territories, calculating approaches and defense lines, he felt something he had not known since his earliest days as a commander. the cold certainty that he could trust no one but himself. The god of war was bleeding, his divine ichor staining the snow of retreat. But something else was rising in its place, something more dangerous than mere divinity. A cornered mortal fighting for survival might yet prove more formidable than a fallen god clinging to faded glory. As the year 1813 drew to its close, Napoleon Bonaparte, no longer quite a god, not yet reconciled to being merely mortal, began to plan his final campaign. The stakes were no longer empire or glory or even power. They were something far more fundamental: survival itself. The game board had shrunk from continents to a single nation, the pieces reduced from armies to remnants, the divine certainty replaced by mortal desperation. But perhaps, he thought as he moved markers across the map of France, that very desperation might prove to be his salvation. After all, gods might bleed differently than men, but they bled all the same. And sometimes, in the very act of bleeding, they remembered what it meant to be human, and how dangerous a wounded human could be. Exile tasted of salt and ash. Napoleon Bonaparte learned this truth on St. Helena, where the South Atlantic winds carried both the sting of the sea and the bitter flavors of remembered glory. The island rose from the ocean like a prison built by nature itself, steep cliffs of black volcanic rock, surrounded by waters that stretched endlessly toward horizons he would never again cross. Longwood House, his final palace, was a study in calculated humiliation. The wallpaper peeled in the constant damp, rats scurried through the walls at night, and every window offered the same view: British soldiers standing guard, their red coats a daily reminder of his fall. The man who had once commanded palaces across Europe now counted his steps from one end of his confined world to the other. 27 paces long, 17 wide, the exact dimensions of his mortality. "Write that down," he instructed Las Cases, his most devoted chronicler. "Let history know the precise measurements of their victory. Let them understand how small a space is needed to contain a fallen god." The memoirs had become his obsession, his last campaign. Not fought with armies and artillery, but with words and memory. Each day he dictated for hours, transforming military disasters into noble sacrifices, political betrayals into strategic necessities. He was not merely recording history, he was creating his own legend, crafting an immortality that no exile could confine. "In Russia," he dictated, pacing his small study, "it was not the winter that defeated us, but destiny itself. The same force that had carried me from Corsica to the throne of France had simply exhausted itself. Even gods must bow to fate." Las Cases's pen scratched across the paper, recording every word. But it was the words Napoleon didn't speak that revealed the deeper truth. The way his voice caught when describing old victories, the subtle tremor in his hands when touching maps of long-lost battlefields. The British Guards watched his decline with a mixture of fascination and pity. Sir Hudson Lowe, the island's governor and Napoleon's personal Cerberus, had ordered every detail of the fallen emperor's life regulated and observed. But even Lowe's rigid protocols couldn't prevent the growing legend that began to emerge from Longwood House. "He gardens now," one young lieutenant reported to his commander. "The man who once conquered Europe spends his mornings tending roses. There's something terrible about it, like watching Jupiter reduced to trimming his own hedges." But the roses were more than mere horticultural distraction. Napoleon approached them with the same tactical precision he had once applied to warfare. Each bed was planned like a battlefield, each bloom cultivated like a potential ally. When asked why he devoted such care to flowers that would never leave the island, his response carried echoes of his old imperial pronouncements. "Even in exile one must create. Even in defeat one must leave something beautiful behind. The roses, at least, do not betray." The betrayal still haunted him. At night, when the South Atlantic winds howled around Longwood's eaves, he would walk the darkened corridors like a restless shade, reciting the names of those who had forsaken him: Bernadotte, Murat, Marmont, Talleyrand, a litany of treachery that had grown only more bitter with time. His relationship with his British captors became a complex dance of mutual fascination and antagonism. Young officers would find excuses to pass by Longwood, hoping to glimpse the fallen emperor. Some were even granted audiences, entering his presence with the nervous reverence of pilgrims approaching a dangerous shrine. One such meeting proved particularly revealing. Captain William Morrison, newly arrived from England, found himself invited to dine with the former master of Europe. The conversation turned to power and its nature. "Tell me, Captain," Napoleon asked, studying the young officer with eyes that had once commanded continents, "what do your historians say of me? Am I monster or martyr in London's coffee houses?" Morrison, flustered by the direct question, attempted diplomacy. "They say many things, sir. That you were both great and terrible. That I reached too high." Napoleon's smile was razor-sharp. "That I dared to grasp divinity with mortal hands. Perhaps. But tell me this, if a man can touch godhood, even for a moment, is any price too high?" The physical decline became more pronounced as the years passed. The man who had once been able to work for days without rest now found himself struggling for breath after short walks. His once keen mind occasionally wandered, mixing memories of glory with present humiliations. "Sire," his doctor, Barry O'Meara, warned, "the climate is killing you, the damp, the confinement—" "The climate!" Napoleon laughed, but there was no humor in it. "No, doctor. What kills me is memory. What poisons me is time. Time to remember every victory, every defeat, every betrayal. Time to understand that even gods can die." He began to suffer from severe stomach pains, the same symptoms that had killed his father. But where Charles Bonaparte had died in borrowed rooms, surrounded by unpaid bills and faded dreams of nobility, his son would leave a different legacy. "Write this down," he commanded Las Cases during one of his clearer moments. "Power is not in victory, but in endurance. Not in conquest, but in the ability to rise after each fall. I conquered Europe with armies, but I will conquer history with words." The memoirs grew page by page, volume by volume. They were more than just military history or political justification. They were the testament of a man who had touched divinity and lived to describe the experience. Every battle was reconstructed, every decision explained, every triumph and disaster woven into a grand tapestry of destiny. As his physical strength failed, Napoleon turned increasingly to philosophical reflection. The man who had once moved armies across continents now waged war with existential questions. "What is power?" he dictated, his voice growing weaker but his mind still sharp as a sword's edge. "Is it the ability to command armies, to crown kings, to reshape the borders of nations? No. True power is the ability to shape how you are remembered. Everything else is merely temporary." The final decline was swift and merciless. Cancer, the same disease that had claimed his father, ate away at his stomach like acid consuming a bronze statue. But even in his last days he maintained the discipline that had carried him from Corsica to empire. "Arrange me properly," he commanded his few remaining attendants. The fallen emperor must still die like an emperor. His last hours were a study in controlled drama. He had planned his death as carefully as he had once planned campaigns, choosing his last words with the same precision he had once used to position artillery. "France, army, Josephine," he whispered, each word chosen to echo through history, each name a carefully selected note in his final composition. The end came on a stormy May evening in 1821, with thunder rolling across St. Helena like distant artillery. As the last breath left his body, witnesses would later swear that the winds changed direction, as if nature itself marked the passing of one who had once presumed to master it. They buried him under a plain stone slab, beneath the willows in a quiet valley. It was a simple grave for one who had once commanded the finest palaces in Europe, but perhaps that very simplicity served his legend better than any marble monument. The epilogue to his story would be written not in stone but in impact. His Code Napoleon would outlive him by centuries, shaping the laws of nations he had never ruled. His military innovations would be studied by generals not yet born. His rise and fall would inspire revolutionaries and warn tyrants for generations to come. But perhaps his greatest legacy was the story itself, the tale of a boy from Corsica who dared to reach for divinity, who held it briefly in blood-stained hands before watching it slip away like smoke on a battlefield wind. It was a story that would be told and retold, each generation finding in it their own warnings and inspirations. In the years that followed, visitors to St. Helena would stand at his grave and ponder the question that Napoleon himself had wrestled with in his final years. What is the price of touching divinity? What toll does godhood take on the mortal who dares to grasp it? The answer, perhaps, lay in the junction between his triumph and his fall, in that moment when the mortal man became something more, and in doing so, ensured he would become something less. The boy who had dreamed of power on Monte Rotondo had achieved everything he had imagined and more, but in reaching for the divine, he had somehow lost the very humanity that had made his rise possible. Las Cases, writing the final pages of the memoir, perhaps came closest to capturing the essence of the man he had served. He was neither God nor devil, though at times he played both parts. He was something rarer and more terrible, a man who saw no difference between dream and destiny, who reached for the impossible and for one brief blazing moment held it in his grasp. That he fell was perhaps inevitable. That he rose so high was the true miracle. The winds still blow across St. Helena, carrying the salt spray that once crystallized on a fallen emperor's lips. The roses he planted still bloom in their careful patterns, tended now by hands that never knew their original gardener. And somewhere between heaven and earth, between history and legend, between divinity and humanity, the story of Napoleon Bonaparte continues to resonate, a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a testament to both the heights that mortal ambition can reach and the price it must ultimately pay. For in the end he was neither wholly God nor entirely man, but something in between, a bridge between the mortal and divine, a reminder that the distance between earth and Olympus can be measured in both triumph and tragedy, in both glory and loss. The boy from Corsica, who became a god only to fall back to earth, had completed his journey. But his story, like the legend he had so carefully crafted in exile, would echo through the centuries, a reminder that sometimes the greatest power lies not in never falling, but in how one falls, and in what one leaves behind when the fall is complete. In the end, perhaps that was his true victory. Not the battles won or the empires built, but the story that would outlive them all, the legend that would inspire and warn generations yet unborn. For as Napoleon himself had written in his final days, "Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever. Let them remember me as they will, but let them remember, for in memory lies the only true immortality any god, fallen or otherwise, can hope to achieve." And remember him they would, not just as the general who conquered Europe or the emperor who crowned himself, but as something more profound and more terrible, a man who dared to become a god, and in doing so showed both the heights that humanity could reach and the price it must pay for such ascension. The story was complete. The legend was born. The boy from Corsica had completed his journey from obscurity to divinity and back again, leaving behind a tale that would echo through the ages, a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are not won with armies and artillery, but with the power of a story that refuses to die. And perhaps in the end, that was the most godlike thing about him of all. The end! If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe.